I did the last segment talking about Alfred Stieglitz, and I have a few more things I'd like to say about Stieglitz and the photosecessionists. So here's another one of Stieglitz's images. One of the things that he's noted for is that he's trying to bring emotional quality to the photograph, not only to be the picture of the way the world is, but also the emotion of how this man is caring for his horses and how that affects the way that we perceive it. So Stieglitz was interested in representing modern life, and for him, the camera was the best device used to document modern life. This image here, which is titled The Steerage, is one of Stieglitz's best-known images. It's become a significant, well-known image that represents Stieglitz and 20th century photography. So this image of passengers riding on a ship has some very interesting aspects to it. One interesting thing is its graphic quality. And also, it's important because of the way that it changes the way that people begin to think and talk about the medium of photography. The title that Stieglitz chose, The Steerage, referred to a place on the ship where people of lesser means are riding at a lower cost. Stieglitz is standing in the upper decks. He's taking the picture from the place where the wealthier people are riding. So the perspective is coming from that position. And the title of this photograph really refers to why he made the picture. Stieglitz talked about this subject representing what he called the swirl of modern life. But he talked about how the photo was based on a formalist concern about objects that were crisscrossing in the frame and how they relate to one another in the composition. So he's really talking about it very formally. And for example, he's talking about how there's a strong diagonal line that separates the top and the bottom areas of the composition, and how the contrast of the two classes of people is divided by that strong diagonal line. Also, he's talking about the contrast of the people below who are wearing white against the darker areas at the bottom of the frame, which bring them into the light and make them more important. So he's talking about this swirling of modern life in a very formal way, which is a new way to talk about the photograph as art. But there's a foreshadowing with this image, which is important not only because of its formal concerns, but also because of where Stieglitz made it in his career and how important it became. So here's another photosecessionist. This is Edward Steichen. He's Stieglitz's right-hand man. He's working very closely with him. And because their names are kind of close, it's easy to get them mixed up. But Alfred Stieglitz is from New York, and Edward Steichen is actually from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But it's interesting to note when you look at this self-portrait of Edward Steichen is that it's actually a gum bichromate print. So you can see that there are brush strokes, and you can see part of the process in different areas, that it has this manipulation to it. So this is an oddity that the right-hand man of the secessionist, who vows to have photography be realistic and not artistically manipulated, makes a portrait of himself as a painter with the gum bichromate process. Here's a few more Steichen images. The image on the left is of the pears, is kind of a straightforward image. The image on the right is a gum bichromate image, a very painterly image of the famous sculptor Rodin, again, which is somewhat contradictory for a photosecessionist to be making. But Steichen is a friend of Rodin, and they're both artists, and I think it's interesting that he chose gum bichromate to represent Rodin. So this photosecession movement cannot be underestimated. These people that were involved in that group really changed the way photography was practiced, the way it was understood, the way it was critiqued, admired, the way it was purchased, pretty much everything. It changed how we saw photography with Stieglitz at the helm. And one of the problems that we'll have when studying the history of photography is that sometimes there's no clear answer as to why contradictions occur. Like Steichen's gum bichromate type images, even though he's part of the secession group, he's still creating other types of photography. So here's a photographer, Gertrude Kassebier. She's German, and she's another member of the photosecession group. And one of her most famous images here, entitled Blessed Art Thou Among Women, you can begin to see here that some idea is being ascribed to these pictures, both through their title and through the methodology of how they're being made with this straightforward approach. So Stieglitz and his group of photosecessionists, including Kassebier, organized their most major photographic exhibit in the United States in 1902, and this included a number of these photographers' works. To show you how different this show is from anything people had seen before, and also how the mainstream media reacted to it, I've included a quote from what one critic said of the show, who said, "We have here merely the excesses of a diseased imagination, Stieglitz, which has been fostered by the ravings of a few lunatics, his group." So this was a very controversial show for its time. So here is this discussion of photographers trying to figure out if photography was art, and of commerce trying to figure out what was this thing and what was it used for, and what are we supposed to do with it, and how do we market it. And then there's people trying to decide which side of the fence photography should fall on in terms of art. Should it look like a painting? Should it look like a reproduction as seen by a mechanical device? And then there was this whole other group that believed that photography's main calling was to have a social context, to be able to point out things in the world that were wrong or should be corrected in some way, and they should target these social ills to make people understand the plight of a certain group of people and to figure out ways to solve those problems. So this kind of photography began to become available because of something called halftone reproduction. Halftone reproduction is what we use to reproduce photographs anywhere in print. Magazines, newspapers, books, anything from a printing press that has used halftone reproduction since its invention, and mainly in reproducing photographs. Halftone reproduction was invented by Frederick Ives in the 1880s. This process depends on a screen of dots. This forces the illusion of the dots being closer together or farther apart to give the illusion of continuous tone. It is, in fact, an illusion. If you blow it up and you look very closely, you'll see that there are actually no grays. There's just black or white. So simply, it's in the way the dots are distanced from one another. So this process sped up the means of distribution, and it changed the way photographs could be distributed. Suddenly, we didn't have to worry about distributing photographs through photographic prints. Up until Ives came up with this process, there wasn't any other way to distribute a photographic image other than making multiple prints from the same negative. So suddenly with this process, one picture could be made easily 100 times or 100,000 times with an equal degree of ease. So it changed the way photography worked and how it was distributed. So Jacob Riis was a photographer who published one of the first books of photographs, and it was called How the Other Half Lives, which was clearly a play on words. Jacob Riis' photographs targeted people who were immigrant workers and child workers living in New York City, and he showed the conditions that they were living in and working in during this time. In his book made in 1890, he highlighted this problem and began to bring awareness to problems that he wanted to recognize. And he began to influence the changing of laws and social situations relative to these people. Another photographer who had the same social conscience at his heart was Louis Hine, and from the early 1900s through the 1930s, Hine worked on two major bodies of work. One of them was child labor, where he spent a great deal of time photographing children working in mills and factories, especially in New England. So he showed the kind of length of working days that these children were having and the conditions that they were working in, talking about the way in which these children were being paid substandard wages and really working to reform the child labor issues in the United States. And his pictures were very successful. Another thing that Hine did was that he was working during a period of time that thousands and thousands of immigrants were coming to Ellis Island in New York City. So he set up a camera there and he began making photographs of these people and their families as they entered our country. And he began talking to them and recording information about each one of them. And each one of the pictures that you'll see in this series of immigrants, there's always these little notes that are made on a typewriter that accompany each photograph. So Louis Hine began to give the names to the faces of people who might otherwise be lost coming into our country, and some of them are probably our own ancestors. Here's some women from Guadalupe, from the Caribbean, 1905. Just beautiful stuff. And he calls this one Madonna, his beautiful mother and child. So I've also included this wonderful photographer, Eugene Atget, here, and he's sort of an unusual character in the history of photography. But here we're talking about a time that's right around the turn of the century, somewhere in the early part of the 20th century, where Atget was photographing uh, actively from the 1890s until the 1920s. So Atget is a citizen of France, and he was seeking to recreate the Paris of his past because Paris was transforming with the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of the places that he grew up knowing as a child were, they were being broken down and factories were going up and things were changing quickly. As the 20th century dawned, he realized that the Paris of his youth was no longer there, and he saw that it was quickly disappearing, and he started documenting it with his camera. And he was using an 8 by 10 inch view camera with glass plates. Here's another wonderful image from Atget. So he began photographing areas marked for demolition, in some hope to be able to preserve them. He made, in a sort of strictly amateurish fashion, out of love, around 10,000 photographs. The photographs were of storefronts, doorways, everyday life. He was photographing just about everything. The only thing he didn't photograph was the upper class life. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in people that were, kind of everyday citizens. He focused his camera on those living in the fringes of society, such as street merchants, gypsies, prostitutes, and young families. Atget is actually very interesting on many levels. Both he's an amazing chronicler of time, and also he's someone who just kept doing this day in and day out because he loved it. He was making some money off of his work. Painters were paying him to make pictures of landscapes that they would paint, but he was making these photographs of Paris and the city for himself. So as we move forward into the 20th century, we now have this group of photographers who in part are coming out of the photo-secession idea that Stieglitz and Steichen had put forward. But now we have a new group, and I want to talk about Paul Strand here. This is Paul Strand, who first achieved some notoriety by showing his photographs as a young man to Alfred Stieglitz. And Stieglitz really liked his photographs, and he supported Strand, and he helped him get his work shown in New York City in galleries. So Strand made this image called Fence, which was part of a series of images that's made with a process called photogravure. And this was used to print very high quality photographs with ink with a plate. I'm going to include a photogravure link here, which you can see at the bottom here, but I'll include it in with the weekly module so that you can go in and look at it and see how that process works. So many of the photosecessionists choose to print their photographs with this process of photogravure because it reveals a very wide range of tones from black to white, and it's quite permanent. Stieglitz, Steichen, Strand, and Caissebier all made photogravure prints from their photographs. Also, another thing about Strand that's very unique is that he prided himself in recording a very precise and accurate reproduction of his images. Strand began to represent a new early 20th century group of photography that dealt with things in a very precise way. This group of photographers became known as precisionist photographers. So Alfred Stieglitz praised Strand's pictures as being rudely correct, pure, and utterly devoid of any trickery. So you can see why Stieglitz really liked Paul Strand. Strand's aesthetic was to use straight photography and believe that the camera had its own aesthetic. It wasn't about some of the trickery of earlier aesthetics, rather it was about the straight, unmanipulated images.